continue on with this series on Satan, his tactics, and his war with God and his people. And this is the second part. And if you remember last time, we talked first of all about the origin of Satan and where he came from and when he was created on the first day of creation along with the rest of the angels. And now we're going to make it down to about a week later, and we're going to talk about the fall of Satan. We're actually going to talk about all three falls of Satan, the three castings of Satan, the first of which being the first one that happened in the beginning. Well, so we'll first of all look at that one. And that was when Satan was cast out of heaven, the mountain of God, whenever he rebelled against God. And we can see this from Isaiah 14 and verse 12. Isaiah 14 and verse 12, this is why I read this verse at the outset of the service today. It says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cast down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations?" I've already proven last time that Lucifer is Satan, that this is not speaking of the king of Babylon or any such thing. This is referring to Satan before he was called Satan, whenever he was Lucifer, the light bearer, as that means. And it also says in Ezekiel 28 and verse 16, likewise, it gives us a text which shows us how Satan fell from heaven. Both of these passages, in Isaiah 14 and then in Ezekiel 28, they both show all three castings of Satan, and we'll be looking at that as we go through the sermon today. In Isaiah 28 and verse 16, it says, "By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire." If you remember, the stones of fire refer to the angels. There was a whole bunch of angels that were created, millions of them, and the Lord was going to destroy Satan and the angels that he took in the rebellion, and we'll talk about that yet today. He would destroy them in the midst of these other angels, and he would cast him out of the mountain of God, out of heaven itself where God dwells. Now Jesus, prior to his death, spoke of seeing Satan fall from heaven in the past. If you look in Luke chapter 10 and verse 18, this is this fall that Isaiah and Ezekiel recorded. This fall is what Jesus is speaking of here in Luke chapter 10. Jesus also speaks of the second fall of Satan, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but this is referring to the first fall, the initial fall from heaven. Luke chapter 10 and verse 18. It says here, "And he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven." Now, of course, we want to look at the tense of the verb there. I beheld, right? That is in the past tense. So Jesus, when he's on earth, when he's speaking, he hasn't died yet. Satan hasn't been cast down at the cross or at the ascension or anything like that. Prior to the ascension, Jesus is saying that in the past he beheld Satan fall as lightning from heaven. And it's a good analogy. I guess it's an analogy. He fell as lightning because he's called Lucifer, the light-bearing one, right? Angels are angels of light. So he fell as lightning from heaven. Now, Jesus, of course, didn't behold this as the flesh and blood man that he was when he was speaking it, because Jesus was not a man until he was begotten in the virgin's womb. We read about that in Luke 1 and verse 35. But what do we know about Jesus Christ? He wasn't only a man. He is the God-man. He was God from all eternity. If you look in John 1 through 3, we'll see here, this is how Jesus beheld Satan fall from heaven as lightning. In John 1 through 3, we read that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So when we read in Genesis that in the beginning God made the heaven and the earth, well, this is that God, the Word, the second person of the Trinity. Jesus Christ is responsible for the creation of the world. And so therefore Jesus Christ, as the Word, as God, beheld Satan fall from heaven. Now, when Satan was cast out from heaven, he still had, after that point, he still had access into heaven after he was cast out the first time. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, and I'm going to go back, but I want to make this point first of all. So if you look in Job 1 and verse 6, Job 1 and verse 6, I want to show you the extent to this casting out, because it wasn't a full casting out to where he was completely banished, where he never had any access to heaven again. He still had access up to God's throne, where he could appear before God, and he could accuse the saints, and I'll show you that in just a second. But in Job 1 in verse 6, it says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them." This is written, a couple of thousand years before the coming of Christ, probably a couple of thousand years after the creation. And yet, even at this time, a couple of thousand years later, Satan still has access up there to God. He can still appear before God's throne, and he can accuse the saints. I'll get there in just a second. Let me give you one more verse, just to show you that Satan did this on more than one occasion. In Job 2 and verse 1. It says, "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord." So he was still able to go back and forth between earth and heaven, right up there to God's very throne at this time. And he could enter in there to accuse the children of God. If you look in Job 1, 9 through 11, Job 1, 9 through 11, it says, "Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." So Satan here, this is his primary job. He's the accuser. That's what the word Satan means. It means accuser. And I can show you that. I will show you that here in just a minute in the book of Revelation. So this is what Satan would do. He'd go up there, and here's a good guy like Job. Hadn't really done much of anything wrong. Job was a sinner like the rest of us, but he was a good man. He eschewed evil and feared God, we're told. And Satan appears up there before God, and he starts causing trouble. And he says, well, yeah, Job's a good guy, but is he fearing you for nothing? Is he just doing this out of just sheer fear of God? Or is he doing this because you've blessed him? Well, you've given him so much, you've hedged him about, you've taken care of him, you've blessed all the work of his hands. Of course he's going to fear thee, right? Aren't most people, don't they have a good view of God whenever things are going well for them? But then when things turn around, then all of a sudden they don't have such a good view of God. And this is what Satan's trying to do. He's trying to talk the Lord into condemning Job to see if he can ruin him. Well, the Lord allows Satan to do that. The Lord allows him to go and to touch Job's possessions. And the thing is, as we know in the story, then Job maintained his integrity. Job didn't end up being destroyed like Satan wanted to. But really the point here is that Satan had access to go and accuse the brethren before the throne of God. But he doesn't have that access anymore, and I'll get into that and tell you why not in just a minute. Let me give you another example, though, of Satan being up there at the throne of God, accusing. Look at Zechariah 3 and verse 1. Zechariah 3 and verse 1. You see, because at that time, we didn't have an advocate. Right? Satan was like the prosecuting attorney, and he goes up there and lays all these charges against God's people. But at that time, we didn't have a lawyer up there to represent us. Right? And Jesus Christ is that advocate, right? It says in 1 John 2 that we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. So it's pretty difficult if you imagine if you went into a court of law and you had a prosecutor there just laying one charge after another on you and building this case against you, and you just stand there and you don't know what to say because you know you're a sinner and you're definitely worthy of whatever Satan's laying on you, whatever the prosecutor is accusing you of, you know you're guilty. What are you going to say? We didn't have Jesus to stand there yet and to be our advocate and to say, you know what, he's been punished. The punishment's already been dealt out, and this charge is baseless. This is a double jeopardy charge. You realize that's what Satan's doing, right? It's double jeopardy. We've already been charged with the crime. We've already been punished with the crime of Jesus Christ, and he's trying to charge us with it again, right? Well, at that time, we didn't have the Lord Jesus as our advocate up there yet. And it's interesting when you go to Romans chapter 8, it says, there is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus. And it says then later on in the chapter, who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It is God that justifieth. Right? Satan can't lay a charge before God in heaven against us anymore, because Christ is the advocate up there making intercession for us. I'll get to that. I know that's at some point later in the outline, but probably by that time you won't remember that I made the point, and I probably won't either, and I'll make the point again. But it's somewhere long down the line, weeks from now. But anyway, it just came into my mind, and it was a good time to mention it. But in Zechariah 3 and verse 1, Zechariah 3 and verse 1, it says there, and he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. And the Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee, O Satan, even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? So here's Joshua, the high priest, standing before God, and Satan comes there to accuse this man. And I like the next verse there. And the Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee. The Lord, all in caps, says unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee, all in caps. Now typically, if you're just a guy like me, I wouldn't say, Chad rebuke thee or something, right? Because I don't refer to myself as myself, right? But if you are the triune God, and the Father's God, the Father is the Lord in all caps, and Jesus Christ, or the Word is the Lord in all caps, and the Spirit is the Lord in all caps, then the Lord, like the Word, can say to the Father, or the Father can say to the Word, the Lord said unto the Lord, rebuke thee. So in that case, that's a proof in the Old Testament of the Trinity. The Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee. Right? So like the Word is saying, the Father rebuke thee, in other words. Right? So you have multiple persons of the Godhead right there in that verse. But once again, the point is, Satan is standing at his right hand to resist him, right? To resist Joshua, to accuse Joshua. And Joshua is clothed in filthy garments, and the Lord then cleans up Joshua and purges him and purges his iniquity, as you see in the next few verses there. Satan, like I said, the word means the accuser of the brethren. I'll show you this in Revelation 12 and verse 10. Now the verse I'm going to read you here is actually referring to the second casting of Satan. This is not referring to the first casting of Satan, but what I want to establish here is that Satan is the accuser of the brethren. In Revelation 12 and verse 10, we'll get back to this verse in a little bit, but Revelation 12:10, it says, and I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now is come salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, for the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before God day and night. So this verse is talking about exactly what the previous two verses we've looked at. In Job and in Zechariah, when the Lord appeared there to accuse those men, this is exactly what it's talking about. He was the accuser of the brethren who accused them before God day and night, before we had our advocate up there. This is referring to the second casting. We'll get to that in just a minute. Now, the first casting of Lucifer happened sometime after the sixth day of creation. I can't tell you exactly when it happened, but I know that it happened after the sixth day. As a matter of fact, I know it happened after the seventh day, but I will prove that in just a second. But let me first of all prove it happened after the sixth day. Last Sunday, I proved that Lucifer was created on the first day with the rest of the angels, if you remember that. Now, the casting was at least after the sixth day. The reason is that Lucifer was in the Garden of Eden before he sinned. Let me show you this in Ezekiel 28 and verse 13. Ezekiel 28 and verse 13. I wish I knew exactly when he was cast down. I think that would be interesting to know, but I can't tell you exactly when it was, but I can tell you that it was not before a certain point. In Ezekiel 28 and verse 13, it says, thou hast been in Eden. Remember, this is referring to Lucifer. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle, and gold. And the workman of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created. So remember, Satan was a created angel. Lucifer was a created angel. And it says there, thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. So we know he was in Eden. Well, when was the Garden of Eden created? That was on day 6, and I'll show that to you in Genesis 2 and verse 8. Genesis 2 and verse 8. Genesis 2:8. It says, "And the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed." Okay, so the garden was planted apparently after God formed man, right? And because he put man in the garden which he had made. So man was created on day 6. So the Garden of Eden was created on day 6. And Lucifer was in the Garden of Eden, obviously, on day 6, or some point after that anyway. We know he was in there when he tempted Eve. We'll get to that in just a minute. So Lucifer was at least around on day 6, and he hadn't fallen yet. Okay? When God finished the creation on the 6th day, he said that everything was very good, right? Genesis 1 and verse 31. "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, and the evening and the morning were the 6th day." Now, in case you're wondering, Genesis chapter 2, the first part of it there, is an expanded account of the 6th day of creation. Because you have God creating everything and saying it's very good, and then chapter 2 starts out with God creating man again. God is like going back and giving you more detail about the 6th day and how man was created and how he breathed in him the breath of life and created him from the dust and so on. Anyway, just in case you ever wondered about that, why that is. So on the 6th day when God is done, everything is very good, right? So Lucifer had not fallen prior to the 6th day, obviously. Because if Lucifer had fallen and taken a third of the angels with him in this giant rebellion in heaven, God would not look at that creation and say it's very good. It's not very good at that point, right? So Lucifer had not fallen by day 6 yet. So therefore, Lucifer sinned and fell from heaven sometime after the 6th day. Now, sometime after that 6th day, Lucifer decided that he wanted to be like God. Let's look in Isaiah 14, 13 through 14. We don't know exactly when this was, but we know it was at least after the 6th day. Isaiah 14, 13 through 14. It says, "For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." So Satan came up with this grandiose scheme sometime after day 6. Because this very thing that he's doing here is obviously sinful, right? This is pride. Lest he fall, a minister is not supposed to be a novice, lest he, being lifted up with pride, fall into the condemnation of the devil. The devil's sin was pride. So clearly, this here, when Satan was having these thoughts of being like the Most High, this is not happening on day 6, because everything is perfect on day 6, right? Everything's still okay on day 6. Now when Lucifer, when he fell, he took a third of the angels with him in his rebellion. Let's look at Revelation 12, 3 through 4. I'm going to get down to, narrow it down a little bit closer to when he fell in just a minute. But let me first of all make this point. So Lucifer wants to be like God, wants to be like the Most High. And there's millions of angels. I think a couple of 100 million angels up there, if I remember right. Let me just look here if I can find that verse quickly, where the Lord gives the numbers of those angels, if I can find that. Yeah, in Revelation 5 and verse 11. It says, "And I beheld, and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne, and the beast and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands of thousands." Okay, 10,000 times 10,000. I'm not going to embarrass anybody here and ask you for that right on the edge of your head or whatever, but that's 100 million. 100 million angels. So 10,000 times 10,000 is 100 million, and thousands of thousands. That's more millions. So, I mean, if you want to get technical, you got 100 million and then at least millions more. So you got at least 102 million or more, and probably a lot more than that. But anyway, so you got over 100 million angels that were in heaven. Right, well, not to mention, just think about this. So that's 100 million angels, but these are the angels. This is written Revelation here, Revelation 5, is after the fall of Lucifer and after a third of the angels were cast down, which I'll prove in just a second. I haven't proved that yet. This is after the angels are cast out, and you've already lost a third of them, and you still have 100 million at that time. So what's that mean? It means you had to have at least 150-some million to have a third of them cast down and still have 100 million left. So God created at least 150-some million angels. Remember, Jesus said that he could call down, 10 legions of angels, I think it was. And a legion, I forget how many is a legion. It's like 10,000 or I forget. What is a legion? I don't remember. I think it's 10,000, but I can't remember. Anyway, there's lots of angels up there is what the point that I'm trying to get at here. Anyway, if you go to Revelation 12, Satan takes a third of those angels with him, 50-some million at the least. Because, if I'm up there and there's 150 million angels, and then there's the omnipotent God on the throne, and I want to try to make some rebellion, you better get somebody on your side, right? You're probably not going to fare so well going it alone. Revelation 12, 3 through 4. You see, and this is why, remember the sermon we did here on church discipline about how you don't let heresy spread? Well, this is a classic example of it. How do you suppose Satan got all these angels on his side? He's probably going around kind of doing a little bit of whispering maybe and saying, you think God, is he really all that? You think he's really all that powerful? I mean, yeah, he says he's the Most High, but you really think that he's omnipotent? You really think that he could stand up to us if we waged some kind of a rebellion on him? And he had managed to talk a third of the church, as it were, the church of angels up there, into rebelling. But anyway, Revelation 12, 3 through 4. It says, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born." This is a prophecy. Prophecies are a little bit, they're usually not given in specific detail. And this is kind of bringing together two things here. The first part of it, when he draws the third of the stars of heaven, is happening. And then consequent to that, then Satan is ready to devour the child as soon as it's born. And the child to be born there is Christ. And that's coming later on in time. But the point I want to focus on there is how the dragon, which is the devil, of course, we read there in verse 9, and the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So the great dragon there is the devil in Revelation 12 and verse 3. And the third part of the stars of heaven are a third of the angels. If we continue reading there in Revelation 12:9, he was cast out into the earth, there at the second half of the verse, and his angels were cast out with him. So the third of the stars of heaven are the angels of heaven that were cast out with him. Let me just give you some more proof that these stars of heaven were angels. Look at Job 38 and verse 7. Job 38 and verse 7. Job 38:7. If I remember right, I quoted this verse in the last sermon on this. "When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." The morning stars and the sons of God refer to the angels. Right? I talked about the sons of God last time being angels. And I'll be talking about that more in the coming weeks when we get to Genesis chapter 6. But they're also called morning stars. These are not referring to the physical natural stars. Physical natural stars do not sing, right? The stars that sang together are the sons of God, are the angels. If you look in Revelation 1 and verse 20, the Lord here tells us that that a star is symbolic of an angel. Revelation 1 and verse 20. It says, "The mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches." So the stars are angels, and in this case the angels are the ministers of the churches. And I've shown you that. What sermon was that in? I think it was that One Pastor in Church Government series, I think if I remember right, where I went through that and showed you that the ministers, that the angels there are referring to the ministers of the churches. And because an angel is a minister, he maketh his angels ministers of fire. And they are messengers as well. That's what angel means, and that's what a pastor is a messenger delivering God's message to his people. But anyway, the point is that the stars there are referred to as angels. And in 2 Peter 2, in verse 4, furthermore, we have another proof that that angels are referred to as stars. 2 Peter 2, in verse 4. We're going to have to compare a couple of verses here to make this point. 2 Peter 2 in verse 4 says, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment." Now, here you have God casting down angels that sinned. In Revelation 12, 3 and 4, you have the dragon taking his tail and bringing with him a third of the stars of heaven, which are said to be the angels later on in Revelation 12 and verse 9. The angels were cast out with him, right? And then Peter gives us a plain statement that God spared not the angels that sinned. So the third of the stars are a third of the angels that sinned along with Satan, that Satan took with him, and the Lord cast them all out when the war in heaven happened. And let's compare that with one more text in the book of Jude. Jude 1, 6 and then 13. Jude 1, 6 and 13. It says, "And the angels, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, hath he reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." I'll have more to say about this text when we get to Genesis chapter 6 here in a few weeks, Lord willing. But the angels were cast out, cast into everlasting chains under darkness. Now, it's an interesting parallel here, or interesting point. If you look in verse 13, this is talking about the wicked, and the wicked are likened to the wicked angels. They both have the same fate. They both end up burning in hell forever. And in verse 13, it says, "The wicked are raging waves of the sea, foaming out their own shame, wandering stars, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever." Angels are called stars. The wicked are called wandering stars. Right? Those angels, the third of the stars that Satan took with him, are wandering stars. Right? They're not keeping their place where they're supposed to. They're wandering around, and they're cast out with the devil. Now it says there in Revelation 12 and verse 4 that with his tail he cast them out. Revelation 12:4, it says, "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven." Now this could be just a figurative way of saying that if you imagine a dragon, which is a snake, and he's got a big tail, and he just kind of takes and sweeps that tail across, and he takes out a third of the stars. Could just be a figurative way of saying that. But I also believe that the figure refers to something other than just a tail sweeping the stars. And I couldn't really prove this for sure, but I think you could make a case that the tail that Satan drew the angels with was his lies. And I'll make this case for you. Because what is Satan called? He's called the father of lies in John chapter 8 and verse 44. And then I have a really neat verse to compare this with. In John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus said to the Pharisees, which were children of the devil, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of it." If there's one thing that Satan is known for, it's being a liar. So when he drew a third of the angels with him, how do you suppose he did it? Through lies, right? Telling them lies about God, telling them lies about what they'll be if they follow him in this rebellion, and so on. Because obviously, what else could he tell them? If you're trying to tell them anything that's going to get them to go against God, what's it have to be? A lie, right? He had to lie to them. He's a father of lies. Now remember, it was said that his tail drew the third of these angels. Let's look back at Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 15. Isaiah 9 and verse 15. And I think this is pretty interesting. Pretty neat. Isaiah 9:15. It says, "The ancient and honorable, he is the head, and the prophet that telleth lies, he is the tail." Isn't that neat? The prophet that telleth lies, he is the tail. Satan's the father of lies, and his tail sweeps a third of the angels with him. The tail is his lies. I think it's a pretty good case for that. If you don't believe that, that's okay. You know, I can still be your friend. But I think that's a pretty good case, I would say. Now, Lucifer's sin and the mutiny and the war in heaven, all this stuff, it happened prior to Satan tempting Eve, but it happened after the sixth day. So you got the sixth day. We know for sure Satan's good, very good, or Lucifer's good, very good. And then we know that Satan tempts Eve sometime after the seventh day. So we know that the war and all this rebellion has to happen sometime between the sixth day and whenever Satan tempts Eve. Because by the time he's tempted Eve, he's already fallen, right? He's already telling her lies in the garden. He's already out of heaven, clearly. And he's fallen. So it's happening sometime between the sixth day and in the Garden of Eden there with Eve. Well, we know that God rested on the seventh day, right? I'm going to narrow it down just a little bit more for you. I wish I could do it even better than that. But in Genesis chapter 2, 1 through 3, Genesis 2, 1 through 3, we see that God, after 6 days of work, then he rested. Genesis 2 and verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So God rested on the seventh day. Well, therefore, since God wouldn't be battling with Lucifer on his day of rest, clearly Lucifer must have fallen after the seventh day. Because it wouldn't be a whole lot of a restful repose if you have 100 or if you have 50 million angels making battle against you, right? I realize God could do that while he rested, I suppose, because he is God, right? And it wouldn't really be anything that would be too taxing on him. But I think it would be a stretch to say that God was battling with 50 million angels whenever he was taking a rest. So I would say it's very, very good logic to say that the fall happened after the seventh day. So Satan made it at least a week. So therefore, the tempting of Eve must have taken place after the seventh day, since Satan was already fallen by that point. Else, he would not have been tempting her to sin. So he's already fallen by the time he's tempting Eve. We know that. Now, I would say that there's likely a period of time that took place between the seventh day and the tempting of Eve, in which Lucifer gathered a third of the angels on his side and tried to exalt himself above the God of heaven before being thrown out. Could it have happened on the eighth day? I suppose it's possible it could have happened on the eighth day. But if you think about it, you got a perfect being here, Lucifer. He hasn't sinned. He hasn't even had a thought of sin yet. How can I prove that Lucifer didn't even have a thought of sin by the seventh day? He had never even thought about creating rebellion against God. How could I prove that? Right? Because I'm saying he did not have a week to be dreaming up this rebellion against God. Why would I say that? Because the Scripture teaches that even the thought of foolishness is sin. Look at Proverbs 24 and verse 9. Proverbs 24 and verse 9. I actually added this point into the outline this morning. I'm going to add it back. I'm going to put it in the real outline because I think it is a valid point. Proverbs 24 and verse 9. And I got a couple other verses here that I can tie in with this. Proverbs 24 and verse 9, it says, "The thought of foolishness is sin, and the scorner is an abomination to men." Let me ask you a question. Is rebelling against God and trying to be like him and throw him off his throne and bringing 50 million angels with you, is that foolishness? Would everybody agree that that is foolishness? If there was ever a foolish act, trying to throw God off of his throne, I would say that's foolishness. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Okay, is the thought of thinking about throwing God off of his throne, is that foolishness? Is that a thought of foolishness? Of course it is. Well, there you have it. It's sin, right? For Lucifer at that time, to even think of throwing God off the throne is sin. But yet, everything was good and very good. There was no sin. Lucifer had not even thought of throwing God off of his throne by the end of the sixth day. Now, I would find it hard to believe that all of a sudden on the morning of day 7, Lucifer just gets thinking, you know what, I don't think God should be on the throne. I think I should be on the throne. And then amasses 50 million angels with him in 24 hours before overthrowing or trying to overthrow God a day later on day 8. That seems a bit far-fetched to me. I have a real hard time believing that. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible, but I highly doubt it. I would think that there would have been a period of time there. What is that period of time? I don't know. Could it be days? Yeah. Could it be weeks? Sure. Months? I don't see any why not. Years? Maybe. We don't know when Cain and Abel were born. Cain and Abel could have been born years later. We don't know when Adam and Eve fell. But was it years? I don't know. Probably not. But could it have been weeks or months? I don't see why not. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just speculating at this point. We know it was at least no earlier than day 8, but I don't see why it couldn't have been significantly longer than that. But who knows? So at this point, Satan could no longer dwell in heaven, but he still had access where he could go accuse the saints. But whenever the rebellion happened, then Satan has this war with God, and God casts him out. Right? He and his fallen angels are cast out of heaven, out of the mountain of God, and they no longer can dwell there. Though Satan can still go up there and accuse, but he can't dwell there anymore. And that happened sometime very early on in the creation. Now let's get to the second casting of Satan. In the second casting of Satan, he's cast down to the earth. Okay? Let's look at Isaiah 14 and verse 12. Isaiah 14 and verse 12. Isaiah 14:12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? Now compare that with Ezekiel 28 and verse 17. The point that I wanted to get there is he's fallen from heaven. That's the first casting. How art thou cut down to the ground? That's the second casting, down to the earth. Okay? Ezekiel 28 and verse 17. Ezekiel 28 and verse 17. Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee. Now he had already cast him as profane out of the mountain of God in verse 16, right? Then in verse 17, he says, I will cast thee to the ground, similar to what Isaiah said. So he's been cast out of heaven. Next he's cast down to the ground, to the earth. Let's look at Revelation 12 and verse 9. I'll give you a text that says that. Revelation 12 and verse 9. Because if you don't have these different castings of Satan, then it's really hard to make any sense of the Isaiah passage, the Ezekiel passage, and then the words of Christ, that he beheld, past tense, Satan fall from lightning as heaven. And then he says later on, now is the judgment of this world, now is the prince of this world cast down. And yet he said, I beheld him falling as lightning from heaven in the past. So if you don't have more than one casting of Satan, you're going to have a problem reconciling all these verses. Revelation 12 and verse 9. I'll get to that verse there when Jesus said, now is the judgment of this world in just a minute. But first, Revelation 12 and verse 9. It says, And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceived the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Okay, so this takes place after God had called the Lord Jesus Christ up to his throne, right? This is after the ascension of Jesus Christ. And you can read about that there in verse 5, in Revelation 12 and verse 5. So this casting out into the earth happened after that point. Happened right after Christ's resurrection. John 12 and verse 31. John 12 and verse 31. Jesus said, now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. And if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. This said he, signifying the death he should die. So see, he says he's putting the timing of the prince of this world being cast out with his death on the cross, speaking of them at the exact same time there. Now is the judgment of this world. Before, in Luke chapter 10, he said, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. But now he's saying, now the prince of this world will be cast out. You see, these are two different castings. One's happening right at the time when Christ is going to be crucified. The other one happened in the past. So after Christ ascended to heaven to reign, there was a second war in heaven between Michael and his angels and the devil and his angels. Let's look at Revelation 12, 5 through 7. I'm going to have more to say about this later on in the study, much later on, like weeks or maybe a month from now. I don't know when. But anyway, we'll get to that when we get there. But I'll just give you the brief version right now. Revelation 12, 5 through 7. It says, "And she brought forth a man-child." This is speaking of the woman clothed with the sun, which is speaking of Old Testament Israel, the church at that time, that Christ came through Israel. That's the woman that he came through. Not speaking of Mary. Even the Catholics would agree with this. They do in their commentary say that the woman there in Revelation 12 is not speaking of Mary, but it's speaking of the church, which I find interesting. I figured for sure, as much as they worship Mary, that they would certainly say that it's her. But anyway, they don't, and they're right on that. "And she brought forth a man-child," verse 5, "who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne." I don't think anybody that knows anything about the Bible would have any question about what that is referring to. A man-child to rule all nations with a rod of iron, caught up to God and his throne. Speaking of the Lord Jesus Christ, right? And it was prophesied that he would rule with a rod of iron, and he ascended up, and he's sitting at the right hand of God now. Verse 6, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not." How far was I going to read? I was going to read down just to verse 7. "So Michael and his angels fought against the devil and his angels." Now in this case, Michael and his angels, Michael's got the upper hand because he's got 2/3 of the angels with him. The devil only has 1/3. Now granted, the devil was, Lucifer at that time, was the anointed cherub that covereth. So he was the most intelligent, the most powerful, the highest class angel that there was. But yet, even with all that, 1/3 of his angels weren't able to outdo Michael and his angels because he prevailed not. They ended up losing the battle here, which I'll get to in just a second. Now, it's likely that this second war in heaven happened when Christ ascended into heaven to reign on his throne. Revelation 12 and verse 5 says there, "She brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne." So I'm going to get into this later on in weeks from now. I used to believe that the second casting happened at 70 AD, but then I realized you just can't, that's not going to fit here in Revelation 12 if that's happening at 70 AD. And the reason is because, I'll get into it right now, just very briefly, because we know that Satan was bound at Christ's resurrection, right? It says that Christ, in Colossians chapter 2, that Jesus Christ spoiled principalities and powers. And Jesus taught to spoil the strong man, you must first bind the strong man to spoil him, right? So Satan was bound and then spoiled, and Christ spoiled him on the cross. So he was bound at the cross, right? Well, if Satan is bound and cast into the bottomless pit, then how is it that there's a war in heaven 40 years later where Satan's taken all the angels to have a second war in heaven? It doesn't fit. And that's when I was going through the study and I realized, wait a minute, I can't hold both positions. I can't say, and I talked to my pastor friends about this too, and they thought that this was right. But anyway, so I would definitely say that this second war happened at the ascension. And if you think about it, Christ ascends from heaven, or from earth, he goes to heaven, and what's going to happen? If Satan still has access up there, right, and he's still up there accusing the brethren, what's Jesus going to do? Sit up there for 40 years and not do anything? No, he's going to throw them out. There's going to be a battle whenever he gets to heaven because he's ruling the universe at that point. So when he gets up there to rule all nations in the entire universe, then Satan is then cast out. That's when the battle happened, the second battle. Look at Acts chapter 2, 30 through 36. Acts chapter 2, 30 through 36. And if that didn't all make perfect sense this time, well, I'll get you the second time around here in a few weeks. Acts chapter 2, 30 through 36. It says, "Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath, to him that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne." Talking about David here, and that Christ would come from David, and that Christ would be raised up to sit on David's throne in heaven. He, seeing this before, spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in hell, neither his flesh did see corruption. This Jesus hath God raised up, whereof we are all witnesses. Therefore, being by the right hand of God exalted, and having received of the Father the promise of the Holy Ghost, he hath shed forth this which ye now see and hear. For David is not ascended into the heavens, but he saith himself, The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou on my right hand, until I make thy foes thy footstool. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus, whom ye have crucified, both Lord and Christ. So Jesus is raised up at the resurrection and sat on David's throne in heaven, ruling and reigning over all creation. Ephesians 1, 20 through 23. Ephesians 1, 20 through 23 shows us that Jesus Christ is up there ruling over all things, principalities and powers, mights and dominions, everything. Ephesians 1, 20 through 23. It says, "Which he wrought in Christ when he raised him from the dead, and set him at his own right hand in the heavenly places, far above all principality and might and power and might and dominion, and every name that is named, not only in this world, but also in that which is to come, and hath put all things under his feet, and gave him to be the head over all things to the church, which is his body, the fullness of him that filleth all in all." So when Christ was raised up and sat on God's throne, he has dominion over all things. Principalities and powers, that is spiritual powers, that is. So whenever he gets up there, the first thing that happens is a war. And Satan and his angels are cast out of heaven entirely. So they have no more access to the heavenlies. They weren't able to dwell up there prior to that point, after the first fall. But after the second fall, they have no more access up there to accuse the brethren at all, because the advocate is there now, and he is making intercession for them, and Satan has no more access up there to God and the Father. So Satan and his angels were defeated and barred from heaven and cast into the earth. Revelation 12, 8 through 10. Revelation 12, 8 through 10. They fought against Michael and his angels, and it says, "And prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world, and he was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night." So no more accusations in heaven. He is fully cast out of heaven now at the ascension of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now that leaves only one last casting. That is the third and final casting. And that is when Satan will be cast down one final time at the end of time into the lake of fire, into hell. Revelation 20 and verse 10. Revelation 20 and verse 10. Now I'm going to have a whole lot to say about the time period between the first casting and the second casting when I get into the war with God and his people. And I'm going to have a whole lot to say from the time between the time of the second casting and the third casting. But right now I'm just giving you those big three milestones, and I'm going to try to fill in a lot of the details over the course of the coming weeks. And that should be a lot of fun. I think you'll really enjoy that. I really enjoy putting it together, and it's really neat looking at the Bible with that in mind, thinking about the war and seeing all the events in the Bible and seeing how they're all playing out and how Satan and God are at war the whole time, and seeing how God keeps winning time after time after time. It's really an interesting study. But anyway, Revelation 20 and verse 10. "And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever." Now this is what the prophecies there in Isaiah and Ezekiel referred to as being cast down to hell. Let's look at that in first of all in Isaiah 14 and verse 15. So right there in Revelation 20, that's the final casting when he's cast into the lake of fire to be tormented day and night forever and ever. Isaiah 14 and verse 15. And no, being tormented day and night forever and ever is not a synonym of annihilation or ceasing to exist, like some people have foolishly claimed. Isaiah 44 and verse 15. 14, pardon me. Isaiah 14, 15. It says, "Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit." And Ezekiel 28 and verse 18. This is the third casting, when he's brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. In Ezekiel 28 and verse 18, "Thou hast defiled thy sanctuaries by the multitude of thine iniquities, by the iniquity of thy traffic. Therefore will I bring forth a fire from the midst of thee, it shall devour thee, and I will bring thee to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that behold thee." So he's brought to ashes, a way of saying that he is cast into hell, into the lake of fire. And just to show you that hell, that he's cast into there in Isaiah, is the lake of fire, I'll just turn you to one more verse in Revelation 20 and verse 14. Revelation 20 and verse 14. "And death and hell were cast into the lake of fire." This is the second death. So the hell that he was cast into was in the lake of fire, we see there. So those are the three castings of Satan. First casting happened whenever he was cast out of heaven. That happened at least after the seventh day, sometime. Their eighth day and beyond. Then the second casting, and that was the third of the angels were cast out with him. Then he still had access into the heavenlies for another couple of thousand years, 4,000 years until Christ came. He could still go up there and accuse the brethren day and night. Then Christ comes, dies on the cross, puts away sin. He goes up there, ascends up to heaven, and he casts Satan and his angels out of heaven where they have no more access to the heavenlies, and binds the devil for 1,000 years, which we'll get into later. And then finally, at the second coming of Christ, and I just kind of brushed over this, I didn't give all the details. At the second coming of Christ, then Satan is fully and finally cast into hell, where he shall be tormented there forever and ever, day and night without end. Those are the three castings. Next time I want to get into Satan's attributes, and we want to learn some things about him. And then we're going to learn about his tactics, and then we're going to learn about how to resist his tactics, and then we're going to go through the whole war from the beginning of time until the end of time. So there's a lot more to come, and I think it should be really interesting for you. Thank you for your kind and patient attention this morning.